Are you okay on sound? Okay. Morning. So I flew in this weekend, and I think Asha reached out to me about a day before that. But I agreed to do the talk because I think it's really a healthy thing to be doing in the COE. I spent some time with Uresh where he gave me some background of what we are trying to achieve. So I'll try to do my best. But I also felt that we all get PowerPointed to death, so I'm going to keep it to one PowerPoint slide today and one potential video that I may use. But the rest of it, I'm going to just talk. And the way I'm going to approach this talk is I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, so you have some context for it. And then I'm going to go back to the same background and pick very specific areas to talk about leadership lessons that I may have learned. And then the third aspect that I'm going to cover in this talk is to talk about career development and how you guys should be thinking about your career and how I have thought about it. I'm going to, at this point, just go back to the leadership journey. So I'm going to go back to segments of my background and then talk about leadership lessons along the way. You're going to help me click on my one slide as I do that. So the first thing I want to talk about, you can click. The first thing I want to talk about is the role of family and leadership lessons that you get from family. So I talked about the fact that I grew up in Assam, right? So I'm going to give you a little bit more color first. So I come from very humble roots. My mom tells me that before I was born, my brothers have even gone without food for days. I grew up in a family of six siblings, so it was a joint family. Now, as I reflect back though, like in any joint family, there will be issues, right? There will be disagreements, people will be judgmental, there will be people who will not feel appreciated, right? But what I also found striking is that in a joint family, there is still, in many families out there, there is still a very common purpose that stays there. And that common purpose is that everyone cares about the growth of every single family member, right? And when things don't go right, people rise to the occasion. Sometimes very young members of the family rise to the occasion, right? I want you to retain that thought and watch this video. There are a few points I want to make. There's a reason I picked that video, right? One is it's making an important point, which as leaders, we need to care about the people that we lead, right? And what better place to learn that than in your own family? Because there is such a common cause that binds you, right? What if you could bring that same sense of common purpose and that ability to care and develop people into an organization, what an organization would look like, right? So that's number one. The second point that I want to make is, as I reflect back on my own career and I look at things that are really important from a leadership standpoint, many times people come to me and ask, Yogesh, like I think I'm performing very well, right? My technical abilities are strong. Why did somebody else get promoted, right? Really what it boils down to is many of the things that I'll talk about, that's what it boils down to. And as I reflect on those things, a lot of these things you learn in the workplace, but you also learn them in your families early on, right? These are basic values like honesty, like integrity, like ethics, decision making, like collaboration, right? Let me take collaboration as an example, right? I gave you examples of joint family where this is an example where a young girl rose to the occasion. There are opportunities for young members to contribute and help people see the light in the right way and collaborate. Family is a very safe environment for you to practice your leadership skills. When there is a wedding happening in the family, there will be a lot of disagreements. That's a great place for you to practice your deal-making skills and business development skills and drive it together. I, in fact, joked about it because I was visiting India to attend a wedding, and my boss, I was in business development in those days, my boss called me, says, how are things going? And I said, John, I feel like I'm still doing business development except in the family, because pulling a wedding together is no easy feat, right? But I'm saying that because it's a very important point. Rather than practicing those skills in a high-stakes scenario, why wouldn't you do it in a safe scenario of your family and learn from there? Ultimately, that will make you a whole person, it will make you a better person, and it will make you a better leader. That's my first thing. Next, I want to talk a little bit about collaboration. So, I was at Symantec's leadership conference last year. This happens for us in the April timeframe. We had a leader by the name David Logan. He's actually a professor of leadership at University of Southern California. And he has a book on something called tribal leadership. I'm going to summarize that whole thing in 2 minutes for you. But essentially what he says is in any organization, there are tribes. What are tribes? Tribes are any groups that are between 20 to 150 people, right? Each of these tribes, they perform at different levels. And that performance is a reflection of what stage those tribes are, right? And you can actually figure out what stage a tribe is by describing them in a certain language, and I'm going to describe it for you. So stage 1 tribes are the ones who will say, life sucks, right? So from their standpoint, life is completely unfair, right? And no matter what they do, it's not going to go anywhere, right? Typically, it's a reflection of really old tribes. Most professional organizations are not there. Stage 2 tribes are ones where the person, everybody would say, my life sucks, right? No matter what I do, I'm not going to get anywhere. I think others can, but this is how things are from my standpoint. That's stage 2 tribes. Stage 3, which is a little better than that, people would say, I am great, right? The unspoken word is, you are not, right? Which means, I do all the work. If only you did your part, guess where we would be? That's stage 3. Stage 4 tribes are the ones where we say, we are great. In stage 4, people actually come together with a common purpose, like the family example I was giving it, and try to undo the competition in more meaningful ways. In stage 5 tribes is where people say life is great, right? And that's where they are actually driven by projects, but these are unique opportunities where you can make lasting impacts on an industry, right? And they're driven by that noble cause, and the noble cause makes them feel life is great. So basically what I would encourage you to think about and I'll talk more about some of these elements. On the collaboration front, the thought that I want you to leave with is, what should you be doing and thinking about to take the organization from level 3 to level 4, right? Your own leadership will shine and come along the way. The third thing that I want to talk about is trust. So I have had so many stories on trust. I'll start with my first one, where I led organizations where I had engineering and product management and technical product management functions. Engineering would say, look, I don't trust my field-facing functions, right? They go talk to customers, but if I were there, I could convince the customer why that hot fix I gave will fix their problem and why that is the right thing. They just don't know. They just don't understand the product. I don't trust them. Field would say, like, engineering doesn't get it. Engineering doesn't understand what it's to be like in the line of fire in front of the customer, dealing with ambiguity and answering problems, right? There's an engineering leader who came to me and said, Yogesh, I'll trust others when they show competence. Unless they show their competencies, I'm not going to trust them. I've seen trust issues between India and US, right, where they would fundamentally question the competence and then not trust each other. So how do you solve this trust problem, right? And I want to just boil it down to the few things that I think are key. First of all, I think to build trust, it has to be unconditional, right? You cannot put a condition saying, once you do this, then I'm going to trust you. It has to be a bidirectional thing, otherwise you will be in a deadlock stalemate situation. You have to say, you have to be willing to take the first step and say, I'm going to trust by default, let the other person do his part, but I'm going to hold him accountable. If they don't do that part, then the accountability should come in the way, right? That has to be the first thing in terms of building trust. The second thing in my engineering and product management example, relationship building and appreciation goes a long way in building trust. I want to explain that a little bit. Many times there is a feeling in engineering where people will say, hey, the field folks come to me only when things are broken, right? They come to me for escalations. So what if the field folks took the time to appreciate engineering at other times? Let's say there was a beta program that was being done and things went well and somebody came and thanked you. You'll be surprised. It helps build trust, right? And I've done that in my career and I've seen the trust improve. Many engineering leaders they don't go out of their way to build relationships. But what if they did and had a little bit of a drink and build that relationship with somebody? it goes a long way towards building that trust. So I want to talk about, so those are the intangible aspects. The final thing that I want to talk about from a trust standpoint is honoring your commitments, right? So ultimately, trust breaks down when you say you're going to do something and you don't do it. So I'm going to take an example from my Japan experience. When I first took on my Japan role and I showed up there were two things that struck me. I met with our sales leader, and he said, Yogesh, you don't drink, you don't speak Japanese, and you don't eat meat. We have our work cut out for you, like in Japan, right? So he was really worried, like, how am I going to drive partnerships in Japan? There were a lot of people, and there are a lot of books written about Japan as to when you operate there, how you have to worry about their cultural norms, how people want to speak their minds, right? All of that was there. So I was dealing with all those ambiguities. There, I also, in one of my first trips there, I went with our CEO, and there was this long list that NEC presented to him. It was like granular stuff, how when you take a clone with volume manager, it was not working, and what library they needed. They were talking about this to our CEO. So my net assessment, again, I'm giving you the punchlines here. My net assessment was that even in Japan, where there is so much talk about all these cultural aspects, ultimately it boils down to you honoring your commitments. The first thing I did there was I said, I'm going to take that list that you presented to the CEO and make sure we deliver on what you've been waiting for 1.5 years. Because unless I can do that, any deal or large negotiations that I'm going to do with you, you're like, it's not going to go anywhere, right? Once I did that, it became the basis of trust building for us. But ultimately, our trust got to a level where I would be negotiating with Fujitsu. I did not even have to do it face to face. I would do it on phone. And I could be saying, like, let's say the other party presented a term, and I would say, Mizumachi-san, trust me, I don't think this is going to fly within Symantec. That guy would take me on my face value, right, and try to adjust his point of view, because that's the level of trust that we built. So long-winded story, but I wanted to share with you, these are the intangibles that go towards building trust. And unless you can build that trust, going back to my previous comment, you cannot transcend from level 3 to level 4, because you won't be collaborating effectively, right? And a great, like from a leadership standpoint, you have to really understand this, because as managers and leaders, you have to understand how do you cultivate that and make your team see that, right? Between the teams that you manage, how do you communicate and build that trust? I want to talk about communication next. So communication, first and foremost, for any person, no matter where they are in their career, it's a journey, and no matter how finished you are in your communication, it can always improve, right? But I'm going to take two stories from my background to explain about communication. So in my first year at Veritas, when I was building this API program, I reached out to a whole bunch of companies. So I remember I reached out to StorageTech, and I said, look, you guys have been trying to integrate with us. We are building this new great API capabilities. There is funding that we need from the partners. But net, I sold on them. I sold them that this was the right thing to do. They said, hey, we want to come meet you guys and discuss it in more depth. I invited them to our headquarters. So when they came over, I, of course, invited our alliances director. I invited my boss. And my purpose was very clear, because I was trying to help them understand the API program. I went straight into it, and I felt at the end of the meeting, I had my mission accomplished. I then had my debrief with my boss, who ran overall BD and alliances. And this is what he told me. She said, Yogesh, I'll be watching you very closely. Because in an alliances organization, you have to come across as a business person first and a technical person second. And because I was an engineer by background, and I had gone into the role, I was still presenting a technical image first. So what was it about me in my communication that presented that technical image first? What I did was I failed to see that in the presence of all these other leaders from the company, how to broaden the scope of that discussion. Any good salesperson will tell you that when they go into an account, they try to broaden the pie for the company, right? It was a great opportunity for the company to discuss broader alliance activities between StorageTech and Veritas in those days, right? I completely killed it, because I was on my mission, and I was so driven by accomplishing it, all my communication was geared towards it. That's number one. Second story that I want to share on communication, I was with our CEO in Japan. This was with the president of Hitachi, I remember. And so I would go to great lengths writing briefs for our CEO, helping him understand what he needed to communicate, what were the issues that would come up, right? All of that was done. So I go into this meeting. It was a 30-minute meeting, a short one. So I kicked off by saying that, hey, do we need translation in this meeting? Because it's a short one. Should we use our time more effectively if translation is not needed? Because I really did not know whether the president of Hitachi Japan needed to speak, whether he was fluent in English or not. Sounds pretty simple thing, right? After the meeting, our CEO debriefed with me, and he said, Yogesh, I do have some feedback for you. And his feedback was, he said, look, you put that president in a very awkward position, because if he doesn't speak English, he has to acknowledge it. It's a pretty awkward thing for him to acknowledge in that kind of an environment, right? That's the kind of thing you have to be mindful of. You have to understand what's going on in the surrounding when you're communicating, right? I've shared these two examples from early on in my career, right? Later on in my career, the issues became different from a communication standpoint. The issues became when an executive asks me a question, how much color am I giving before I net out my answer? Am I giving the punchline first? Or am I giving him all the background and keeping him in suspense for 5 minutes and then saying, oh, by the way, here is the answer to your question. You have to give the punchline first when you're talking to executives. You sometimes have to elevate your messaging to a level where it's relevant to board member level people, right? I mean, you have to go from granular level issues to others. So that's why I said communication is a journey, right? No matter where you are, you can always do better. But I would highly encourage you to think about what are the shorter term things that you could be looking at, right, from a communication standpoint. I can only share my stories of what I've gone through. Next I'm going to talk about gut and the power of gut and decision making. So people sometimes ask me, how do you make decisions? Somebody asked me yesterday, in fact, right, saying, you talk to a lot of people, people come with data, like data may disagree in some way, there are different opinions. How do you make sense of all of this, right? How do you know whom to trust, whom to not to? How do you know where to filter the data? So first of all, my approach to decision making has always been that I want to seek a lot of input. I want to hear everybody's viewpoint. I want to be data driven, but ultimately you have to make a call, and the call may be an unpopular one. That part is simple. But what I've also found is many times my gut tells me to do something. After listening to all this, my gut tells me to do something. What I've also found is when I go against my gut, I've almost always repented it. But how do I tell a team member that, hey, I don't want to go with what you're saying because my gut tells me to do so. So I sat down with Dr. Deepak Jain, who was the dean of Kellogg School. That's where I went to school. Who is now the dean of INSEAD. I said, Dean Jain, this is my struggle. Like, how do you explain it? And he said something which really summarizes for me. He said, Yogesh, what you call your gut is really your experience coming together in a very meaningful way. So don't lose sight of that. Like, an analogy I will give is when you are driving a car, let's say you are on a highway and there is a lane merging into your highway, your brain factors all the various mathematics and says, are you going to collide or not, and should you slow down or should you speed up? How did you do that is very difficult to explain, but there is a ton of things that go behind the scenes in making that happen. Your gut is a very similar thing, but it brings the combination of a lot of your experiences into making this come together. So my guidance to you is listen to your gut, right? Of course, validate it with the various data driven and all that, but once your gut guides you strongly in a certain direction, you should trust it. And if that's telling you, if that's convincing you that is the right decision, even if it's the unpopular one, make it, right? I would also point you to two great books to read. They're written by one of the best CEOs out there, Jack Welch, who ran GE for a very long time. His first book is called Straight from the Gut, where he talks about a lot of his experiences. And the second one is called Winning, where he again gives a much broader view on business. So that's on decision making and gut. I want to talk a little bit about transparency next. I hope it's okay to hold questions to the end, right? So let's talk about transparency. Again, I'll start with a story. So when I became GM of that storage management group, I used to run product management. My SVP decided to reorg, gave me a broader role. I was happy. 2 weeks later, he comes to me, essentially with a gun to my head, saying, Yogesh, this is in 2008 times when the economic downturn was happening. He says, times are tough. The business itself was not a very profitable one. So he said, we have to cut budget by about 25%. Right, and he wanted me to come back with a recommendation on what we wanted to do, right? It could mean killing the business even in a matter of 2 weeks or so. So first of all, like all my thrill about the new job was gone at that point, right? But I also felt very alone because I was in a new role and I said, look, this is a pretty difficult call to make. How do I do this, right? Because, and I struggled with the fact that who else do I involve in that decision-making process? And what I did, talking about transparency again, is I decided to share it with my direct staff, right? And I basically made them fully understand the scenario and I solicited their help in working through it with me. Now, while the overall situation was unpleasant, what I was pleasantly surprised with was they like approached the exercise with great spirit. In some cases, they very well knew that it could impact their own jobs, right? Because the scenarios could lead us to anything. But they participated in a very open model. In fact, one of my direct reports who ran a site for me later on came to me and said, Yogesh, you should use this as an opportunity to close down that site. Because the question has always been there, like rather than just making it a slow death, let's act on it. He knew he was digging his own grave, but that's what he did in that transparent discussion. So I shared this. What I've generally observed in my career is transparency can never hurt you, right? Yes, there are some scenarios where you need to maintain confidentiality of various topics, but in general, it's better to be transparent, right? I've wound down businesses where later on in my career where I had to take similar approaches. Many times as managers, it's easy to get into the myth saying, oh, I have this information, and if I control that information, wouldn't I have more power? It's a myth, right? You are better off being transparent and sharing that information with the broader audience, right? It means when things come down, top down as FYI messages, how many times do we take the time to actually circulate? All of that is about transparency. So my again core message there is transparency doesn't hurt. I think this is my final point on the leadership one, which is about people development. So we started this talk with the video on caring, right? And caring ultimately means you have to talk about development of people. So I'll share a couple of stories for you. One comes from EMC itself. I just joined 3-4 months ago. In my first weeks, one of the persons who worked for me, he came and said, Yogesh, I'm doing this, but really my passion is somewhere else, right? So he kind of left it at that with me. Later on, he repeated a similar thing with me, right? He had the same perspective. I told him all along, I said, look, if your passion is somewhere, you should follow it, right? If there is a great opportunity inside the company, I'll absolutely support you. And late December, he actually found something that was pretty interesting, and I said, you should go take it, right? It actually meant in my side, because I have a new organization, it actually means more disruption in my organization. But if the trade-off is between make my life easier versus he has a great opportunity that's aligned with his passion where he can grow, which call should you make as a manager? It should always be about the growth of the other person. You can always put transition plans in place. You can always handle product issues. But those kind of opportunities don't present all the time for people in their growth, right? So that's one. The second thing from a people growth perspective I'll share is it's a story from my semantic days. I had an engineering leader who worked for me, great guy, very data driven. What I observed about him was he would get angry, right? So when there were tough issues being discussed, he could lose his pulse, right? And but he would do yoga. He was very self-aware. He would talk to me about emotional intelligence and all those things, right? So one thing I would tell him is, look, it's not good enough to be aware. You have to act upon that awareness. But finally, what I decided to do was I put him with an executive coach. He was a director level person with me, right? But first and foremost, the point I'm making is you have to evaluate the scenario. In some cases, even though the person may not be senior enough, but you think if the person has potential, you should take the investment and do that. Now, that executive coach, when he worked with him, he did what's called a Myers-Briggs test. Myers-Briggs test is a personality test, and we found that he was in this unique 10 to 15% category who may be comfortable with confrontation, for example, right? Who have strong beliefs as well, which is what was leading to his behaviors and all that. But generally what I'm saying though is that as managers, you have to take that serious and genuine interest in people development. In this particular scenario, it's easy to say, no, it's not working out, right? You have personality problems. I have enough data which tells me that you just don't collaborate, right? Versus do you take the time to figure out what's behind the scenes, right, to really course correct it. Third thing I would say on people development is the power of 360, and I want to tie it to something else. So look, there is always a belief of what you think who you are versus how others perceive you. The only way you will know in depth of how others perceive you is when you do 360s and then you hear their comments, right? But the thing that I really want to talk about is how do you act on that 360, right? It's easy to just look at people's comments and say, oh, they pointed out this weakness on me and let me go address it. If you only focus on your weaknesses and try to address it, it's like the analogy would be you have a cow and you're trying to teach a cow how to fly. It's never going to happen. If you look at great leaders, even Obama included, most of them have about 2 to 3 big strengths, and they capitalize on those strengths in a big way. Obama is very strong in communication, for example, right? And he capitalizes on it a very big way. So statistics show that most leaders, like it's really 4 maybe at most, right, that they really shine. And they may be average on others. You should not have a fatal flow. Fatal flow can be bad. So the guidance and I've seen be very successful is the thing to think about is how do you take those strengths and then identify what is a complementary skill that you need to develop that gives you non-linear growth. I'm going to give you an example. Let's say somebody feels that I'm okay on communication, right? But his strength is that person has very high integrity and very high conviction, very high honesty. He can use that strength to actually and course correct his complementary skill to help people see him the other way. What he can do is if you actually have that strong conviction and your honesty is that great, you can be more assertive in your communication. You don't have to do many of these other things that I talked about in communication. You can focus on assertiveness. And because you are so strong on the other dimension, the assertiveness will make the rest of your communication shine. And it will give you non-linear growth. So the net point I'm still making though is that it's very, very important for you to focus on your strengths. Weaknesses will always be there, but you have to take a strength-based approach towards developing your people. This one is a two-way street though. This one, what I'm saying is, applies as much to you as it is to your approach of developing your people. With that, I'm going to shift gear, and this one I'll breeze through a little bit. I'm going to talk about career development, and I have a few things that I want to talk about. The first one is getting out of your comfort zone, and I want to share a couple of examples with you. So when going back to my work at Veritas, one of the first things that I did for the company was I built a partner program. It was very successful. We signed up about 50 partners. We raised more than $1 million in the first year itself. After I did it for a year, my relationship with my boss was new as well. He had some other people who had worked for him. He at that point said to me like, hey Yogesh, I'm going to restructure. I'm going to have this person come and run the team. And he essentially wanted me to report to that person. Now, I was very comfortable with that program though. I had built it. I felt so entrepreneurial about it. I said, I'm the founder of that program, right? How can you do it to me? That was the thing, and there was an attachment. There was this other peer of my boss who used to run Asia Pacific and Japan. I knew nothing about China, nothing about Japan and all that, right? But he approached me because he had seen me in action in other places. So I had a choice at that point. I could stay in my comfort zone and reporting to the other person or just do something else. I took the leap of faith and I decided to go do this something else, right? And I'm happy I did, because that honestly, I would not have learned anything new by running the program again for another year. But it's very easy to get stuck in that mentality of saying, hey, let me just keep doing what I'm doing, right? But you have to get out of that comfort zone. Another example I'll give you from my own career is after I ran business development and alliances, I said, look, ultimately I'm a product person and I don't see myself as a VP of alliances. I don't see myself like becoming an executive in the alliance world, right? Because much of that is about relationship building as well. So there was another point in my career where I had to take that leap of faith and say, I'm going to consciously go out and do something else, right? It will always be there. You constantly have to reinvent yourself. People who may have done a piece of marketing may want to be CMOs, like it will always happen. But getting out of that comfort zone is pretty key. The third point I want to illustrate here is it's important to work for leaders with different styles. I feel fortunate that I had an opportunity to work for both. Had I continued working on that partner program, I guarantee you I would not have worked for this person who is now at SAP, because my career path would not have taken me in that direction, right? So you have to take those risks. It's okay. You have to make your decisions. You have to do the calculations. But rewards come with some risk taking, right? If you don't take those risks, your rewards will also be commensurate to those, right? So that's my point number one. The second thing that I want to talk about is managing your boss. Second is it's a very bidirectional, mutually dependent relationship. What your boss expects out of you is loyalty, like commitment to deliverables, all those things. What you expect out of your boss is that, hey, he's a connector to the various groups, right? He's bringing the strategy and vision. So what the point that this paper makes is, if you want to strengthen that whole relationship, you have to first think from your boss's perspective. Why does he act and behave in a certain way? Because your view of the world is going to be different from your boss's view of the world. So if you adopt your boss's view of the world, you will begin to see things his way and you will align, right? So for example, if I take an example from many of the things I've been discussing here, a lot of people here are involved with host software stack, right? For you, it's critical, what am I doing with the host software stack? What is top of mind for me is, where am I taking the overall management software group and where does the host software stack fit in as part of that? You are better off understanding what am I trying to do at that top level and understanding that vision and strategically aligning to it rather than being miserable and getting stuck into that whole thing, right? So that's point number one. Second point is, if your relationship with your boss is rocky, you have to own it to manage and fix it. That's what that paper says. Because if the relationship is rocky and you adopt the view of the boss, you can actually do something about it, right? So that's the second point that I want to make. These are all important points from a career development standpoint. I've tried to pick the ones that I thought are really important and sharing this with you. Third thing I want to talk about is sweet spot. So I'm going to again go back to a story on my own, which must be familiar to a lot of you. So when I did my undergrad here in engineering, I did computer science, but I want to share with you how I picked computer science, right? So I was one of the rank holders in Assam. There was all these regional engineering colleges. They came to Guwahati. They had this table laid out, and the way it starts is they have their list of colleges, they have a list of departments available. The first person who has like rank number 1 goes in, he picks a thing, and then dynamically you are making decisions as to which college and which discipline will be available for me and what do I pick. And I had 5 minutes or less than 5 minutes to make that decision as that happened. That's how I picked computer science. Okay? But honestly, in those days, I did not know the difference between electronics and computer science. Right? I thought electronics was my first choice. Computer science would be second. I got computer science. I was happy. Later on, I felt, hey, computer science is so logical. I love it. Right? But at the point of making the decision, I didn't know it. There's a broader point I'm trying to make, though. As you figure out where your passion is, it will take time. You have to experiment with various things. You may have to be in different types of jobs to really figure out where your strengths are and where your passion is. When I was doing computer science, at one point I wanted to do PhD because I loved what I was doing. But when I did not get into the schools that I wanted for PhD, I decided to go work for SGI. As I worked at SGI, I did not enjoy doing bug fixing all the time. I had the opportunity to work with partners when I was at SGI, and I said, hey, I like that a little bit more. So I said, I'm going to go try it and go do my MBA. So it's very important for you to find that passion first of all, because if you really want to be successful in your career, your passion has to line up with it. But that's not what I mean by sweet spot. The sweet spot for you is really the intersection of three things. It starts with passion, but there are two other things that have to be there. Your skill sets have to be lined up with it, and the organization's needs have to be lined up with it. When those three things come together, you are in your sweet spot, and you're likely to do very, very well in your career. So as you think about your career development, right now, this part of the talk is not from a manager's view, it's about you and how you should be thinking about it, right? Then the chances are very, very high that you're going to grow. My next point is going to be about the power of network, and again I'm going to go back to a little bit of a story. So when I was at Symantec, as I was doing well there, at one point I was, and this was in Silicon Valley, I reflected and I said, when I look at my relationships, because I've been so knee deep in doing my job, a lot of my relationships were actually inside Symantec. And so the question I asked myself was, I live in Silicon Valley, which is such a thriving place, so many VCs, so many startups. What am I doing, right, in terms of relationship building and all that, and what does it mean about my own development? So I started talking to some friends of mine who were entrepreneurs, and they're very powerful networkers. So one friend of mine is very well connected with the VC community, and I'd share the advices that they gave me. His first advice was, hey, when somebody comes, asks for help, no matter who it is, you should help, right? You may come ask me for help tomorrow, I should help, because I don't know when in the future I may need your help. That's how you network. Second thing is, when you're networking and you're, say, seeking somebody's input, you can end the meeting by asking about, who else should I talk to? That's how you're expanding your network, right? It's an easy question to ask. People will actually give you names to talk to. There were people I met, again, these are all friends of mine. One friend of mine, he had a list of 200 people which he would recycle on a bi-weekly basis, so that basically every 2 weeks he was having breakfast on a Friday with a person on that list, and that was his way of networking. Another friend of mine who was from who is of a similar networking background, he actually built a company that he sold in 9 months for $50 million. What was the basis of it? He had great relationships into the VC community, right? And those relationships go a long way towards deal making. So, so what I did in my career last year, some of you have talked about Tycoon to me, is in the Valley we have this group called the Indus Entrepreneurs. And so I got more involved with that, right? And I ran a conference for them last year. And in the process, I built great relationships with VCs, with entrepreneurs, with executives of other companies, many of whom still reach out to me. And so as you think of your career development, right, I can't emphasize this enough, because if you were to ever try to do something else, you will have to rely on that network. And the broader your network, the more help it will be for you. This is my last point. So I'll explain the bullet. This is a theme called success to significance. This is something I heard from the same gentleman I referred earlier, Dr. Deepak Jain, who is the Dean of Kellogg School. So he actually invested a lot of thinking, particularly because he ran a business school. He said, why, when we impart an MBA education, what's the purpose, right? When you look at corporations, why do corporations exist? You could say that corporations exist to create shareholders' value, or we mint MBAs so that they can go to corporations and create more shareholders' value, or we mint MBAs so that they can go drive more revenue, or they can drive more profits. But is that the goal, right? And so what he shared with me is, or more broadly I should say, not just with me, is he came back to Indian philosophy. He said, when you look at Indian philosophy, we spend our first 25 years studying. Right, really focus on studying. We try to build a good foundation. Then the next 25 years, we try to be successful, right? We focus on success. How do I take that foundation and be successful? When you look at that 25 years after that, it's focused on significance, which is what do you do with that success to have some kind of a lasting impact. When you look at your own parents, I'm sure you see those aspects in some form or the other. And the 25 years after that is what's called sannyas, right, which is all about sacrifice. So his view on Kellogg School was, when you join Kellogg School, and this, I'm not trying to preach for the school, I'm trying to make a point, that you start your journey from success to significance. So I want to explain that, which is, as a business student or as a leader, it's not enough to be successful. You need to use your platform that you generated from your success to do good for the society, right? And that goodness does not have to be broad. If you do to one person, you could mean the world, right? For example, there are leaders I may have worked with, because of opportunities that they gave, they mean a world to me, because that's what really made my career happen. But there is a lot of opportunity for us to do it, but you need to be successful first, because when you are successful and you have platform, people will listen to you. Bill Gates runs this foundation, right? But his success helps him do that more effectively. So that's a thought I want to leave you with, because it's not enough for you to focus on your career and development only from the standpoint of all the things that we were talking about. Ultimately, it's about what difference do you make to the society. I myself am not there. This is a thing that I personally would need to strive to as well, but I thought my talk would be incomplete if I didn't emphasize that enough. With that, I'll stop and take any questions you may have.